In the last movie, we were just talking about how the public folder is different from the app folder, and it raises the issue of how server requests are handled by the Rails framework, and there's some important subtleties to it that we should examine a little more closely. Previously, when we looked at the MVC architecture, I showed you a diagram that simplified it down to just the MVC portion. Now I'd like to step back a little bit and give you a slightly more expansive, but still greatly simplified view of the Rails architecture. A request goes from the browser to the web server, and the very first thing that the web server will do is look into the project's public directory to see if there's a file in there whose path and name exactly match the request that came in from the browser. Now if it finds one, it will return that file to the browser and it will never access the Rails framework. This makes sense. I mean, there's no reason to use the framework and go through all of that code when the request is just for a self-contained static HTML page. And it's really going to speed things up when the server is gathering together images and style sheets and other static assets that it wants to send to the browser. It's going to make our pages load as quickly as possible if we don't have to go through the framework to give back these simple static assets. But whenever the web server looks into the public directory and it doesn't find a matching file, it's next going to ask the Rails framework to see if it can handle the request. At that point, the request goes to Rails routing. Routing is going to try to parse the URL to determine which controller and action to use. It will then execute that controller action, making requests to models and pulling from the database as needed, and finally rendering a view and sending the results back to the web server. Now, if the view is an HTML page, which it typically is, but it doesn't have to be, then the web server treats it exactly like a static HTML page that it might have pulled back from the public directory. There's no difference. It doesn't make a difference that we went through the whole Rails framework and compiled the page dynamically. To the web server, it's just an HTML page at that point. So it pulls in whatever images and style sheets it needs and sends it all to the browser. There's two important points that I want to make sure you're clear on in that. And the first is that the HTML page is the same whether it comes from the public directory and it's a static page or whether it's a dynamic page generated by the Rails framework. It's just an HTML page. The second thing is that the public directory stands between the web server and the Rails framework. Now, why is that important? Because the public directory can interfere and get in the way if we're not careful. Let me show you an example and you'll see what I mean. So you can see I've got my project open and I've got the public folder open so you can see the contents of it. You'll see that there are a couple of files in here like 404.html, right? Let's go ahead and just open up our terminal. I'm already navigated inside my Rails application, and let's launch our server. So Rails server, WebBrick boots up. It's now listening on port 3000 for requests. So let's now go to Firefox. Let's open up Firefox and go to localhost :3000. Now, if I don't put anything after it, what it's doing is it's going to go to the public directory. That's where we're starting. All right, the path here is starting at that directory. So for example, if I type /404.html, page you were looking for doesn't exist. Now, that's not a simple, I didn't get the page. That is the page, all right? That actually is the content of that page, 404.html. If we open it up and look, you'll see the page you were looking for doesn't exist. So you can change the contents of this and you'll see, you can look at the page source. This is what that 404 page is. And it's a basic HTML page for I couldn't find what you were looking for. So that's how we get to that public directory. Now let me show you another example. I'm going to just hide these for a second, and I'm going to drag a folder here I've got called demo, and I'm just going to put it inside the public folder. And inside demo is another HTML file called just test. And it's just a real simple HTML file, nothing special about it. You can recreate one yourself. But what I want to show you is that if we go back to our web server's still running, and now if I ask it for demo/test.html, it gives me that static page back, right? Demo is the folder that it's in, and test.html is the file, okay? If we say demo/test, it still finds it, all right? The web server is set up to say, oh, if you didn't tell me HTML, I'm going to guess that that's what you meant because we're using a browser and we're using HTTP. I'm going to assume HTML is what you wanted. Now, not all web servers may do that, but that's how this one behaves. So now let's refresh our memory here. We had already created a controller called demo, and to access it, we wanted the action called index, right? There it is. That's our hello world page. Notice how similar these are, but there's a difference. If we look at our command line, WebBrick came up and logged the fact that I tried to go to demo index. The Rails framework output this information, told me how fast it did it, some things like that as well. So here, I'm going through the Rails framework, but when I go here, I'm not. it's coming up with that static page. See the difference? Well, here's the place where it's important. Let's go back to here, and let's now change the name of test to be index.html. All right, so demo index.html. Now if I load up demo index, now you'll see it loads up the static page. If you don't believe me, you can go to another page and come back. We also had an index page, right? The welcome aboard page, demo index. There we are. Now we're getting our static page. We're not getting the action index. The static page is in our way, and you can see the web server never hit our Rails framework. Okay? It just returned the page immediately. Well, where this is especially important is because when we first create our Rails application, look what it gives us, index.html. Now you probably remember from HTML, index is a little bit of a special name for a page. That's what we use for the default page on most web servers. And it allows us to be able to say simply demo and get that index page, right? It defaults to index.html. So what we get when we go here, localhost 3000, we get that welcome aboard page. That's exactly what this page is right here, index.html. And it's now getting in the way of us being able to access our application at this root, right? We want to be able to just go straight to our application. We don't want this welcome page all the time. And in fact, it tells us here, it says remove or rename this file. That's why. Okay, the file is in the way. So let's do that. Let's rename it. You can call it whatever you like. Let's call it index default.html. So there it is. You can call it something else, index old. You can delete it, whatever you want to do. And just because we don't want this to get in the way also, let's go ahead and change its name as well. And let's say demo example. So now that'll stay out of our way. If we tried to go to localhost 3000 demo example, we'll still see it. But if we try to just go to demo/index, there we go. You'll see that we go back through our Rails application again. Now you may need to refresh your page, hit reload in order to get it to give you a fresh copy because browsers sometimes cache pages. But once you do, you should be able to go back to your Rails framework again. So now that we've moved our default page, if we go to localhost 3000, it still takes us to this page, but that is because it's cached. So let's reload the page. You'll see that now actually we get a routing error. So no route matches /. All right, so with nothing else after it, my default directory now doesn't have an index.html page in it. It goes to the Rails application, right? It is hitting the Rails application. We can see that because we can see things happen here, right? Get this, nothing after it. Well, the routing says, sorry, I don't have a route that matches that. So we need to set up some routes, and that's what we'll do in the next movie.